Imagine yourself in the crowded streets of ancient Jerusalem. The air is alive with the sounds of bustling merchants, the aroma of spices, and the hum of prayers. It's the time of Passover, a season of tradition and celebration. But today, something feels different. There's a tension in the air, like the city itself is holding its breath. Whispers ripple through the crowd. Jesus of Nazareth, the miracle worker, is being led to his death. You hear the heavy footsteps of Roman soldiers, their armor clanking as they part the sea of onlookers. The crowd presses in, their faces a mix of fear and morbid curiosity, and then you see him. Jesus. His body battered, his face streaked with blood and sweat. Each step he takes is a struggle, the weight of a wooden cross pressing down on him like the weight of the world. He stumbles, and for a moment time seems to stand still. Then out of the crowd, a man is pulled forward. His name is Simon, a traveler from Cyrene in North Africa. The soldiers bark orders at him, shoving him toward the cross. Simon hesitates. This wasn't why he came to Jerusalem. He's just a pilgrim here for Passover. But there's no choice. He bends down, places his hands on the rough wood, and feels its unbearable weight. In that moment, his life changes forever. Why Simon? Out of the thousands of people crowding the streets that day, why was he the one chosen? Was it chance, or was it something more? Did God see something in Simon that no one else could? These are questions that linger, questions that pull us deeper into his story. A story of faith, transformation, and the unexpected ways God calls ordinary people into extraordinary roles. Simon's story isn't just about what happened in Jerusalem over 2,000 years ago. It's about us. How often do we find ourselves in situations we didn't choose, facing burdens we never asked for? Moments that feel like interruptions, but may actually be divine appointments. Like Simon, each of us has a cross to bear. Each of us is invited to step into the unknown, to walk a path we never imagined, and to find purpose in the process. As we begin this journey into Simon's life, take a moment to reflect. What cross are you carrying today? What might God be teaching you through it? Let's explore how Simon's brief encounter with Jesus became a defining moment, not just for him, but for generations to come. The story of Simon of Cyrene begins with just a few verses in the Gospels, but its significance is profound. In Matthew 27:32, we read, "As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross." It's a single sentence, but it paints a vivid picture. Jesus, physically broken from the brutal scourging, is struggling to carry the weight of the crossbeam. His steps are unsteady, his strength is failing. The Roman soldiers, known for their efficiency and cruelty, realize he won't make it to Golgotha on his own. Their solution? To pull someone, anyone, out of the crowd. And that someone is Simon. Mark's gospel adds another layer to the story. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. Mark 15:21. Here Mark provides a detail that may seem small but carries great meaning. Simon is the father of Alexander and Rufus. Why mention these names? Scholars believe it's because Simon's family became known in the early Christian community. In fact, in Romans 16:13, Paul writes, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me too." While we can't confirm for certain that this Rufus is Simon's son, the possibility adds a profound layer to the story. Simon's encounter with Jesus didn't just change his life. It may have shaped the faith of his family and left a legacy that carried into the early church. Luke's gospel gives us yet another perspective. As the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. Luke 23:26. Notice the phrase, "behind Jesus." This simple detail is rich with symbolism. It mirrors Jesus' own words in Luke 9:23. "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me." At that moment, Simon becomes more than just a man forced into an inconvenient task. He becomes a living example of discipleship, walking behind Jesus and sharing in his suffering. But who was Simon? Why was he in Jerusalem that day? To understand, we need to go back to where his journey began, in Cyrene. Simon of Cyrene's story takes us to a fascinating place, Cyrene itself. Located in modern-day Libya in North Africa, Cyrene was a thriving city known for its rich culture, bustling trade, and significant Jewish community. Historical records, including those of Flavius Josephus, tell us that Jews had been living in Cyrene for centuries, maintaining strong ties to Jerusalem. For Jewish families in Cyrene, making the pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Passover was more than a tradition. It was an act of devotion, a journey to connect with their heritage and faith. For Simon, traveling roughly 800 miles to reach the holy city would have been a significant commitment, both spiritually and practically. Mark's gospel emphasizes Simon's origin, stating specifically that he was from Cyrene. This detail isn't just geographical, it's symbolic. Simon's presence highlights the diversity within the gospel narrative. Here was an African man, far from his homeland, yet chosen to play a pivotal role in the story of Jesus. His inclusion foreshadows the universal reach of the gospel, a message meant for every nation, every people, every corner of the earth. Cyrene's connection to the early Christian movement is further underscored in Acts 13:1, which mentions prophets and teachers from Cyrene as leaders in the church at Antioch. Similarly, Acts 11:20 tells of believers from Cyrene who helped spread the gospel to Gentiles. These references suggest that Cyrene played a significant role in the early growth of Christianity, making Simon's part in the story even more meaningful. But why Simon? Out of the thousands of people in Jerusalem during Passover, why was he the one chosen to carry the cross? Was it simply because he stood out as a foreigner? Did his physical strength catch the soldiers' attention? Or was there something deeper, divine providence orchestrating this encounter? We can only imagine Simon's thoughts as the soldiers grabbed him from the crowd. Confusion, fear, perhaps even anger. He had come to Jerusalem for a sacred purpose, only to find himself caught up in an execution procession, forced to carry the cross of a man condemned to die. Yet what seemed like an unjust interruption would become a moment of profound significance, a moment that would ripple through history. Simon's experience reminds us that God's plans often unfold in ways we don't expect. Like Simon, we may find ourselves thrust into situations that feel overwhelming or unfair, but it's in those moments that we're often drawn closer to God's purpose. Simon's act of carrying the cross wasn't just a physical task. It was a spiritual calling, a moment of transformation that would impact not only his life, but the lives of countless others. When Simon of Cyrene was pulled from the crowd to carry the cross, he likely felt more like a victim than a hero. Imagine his perspective. A pilgrim, walking into Jerusalem with hopes of celebrating Passover, suddenly yanked from his plans by the force of Roman authority. The weight of the wooden cross wasn't just physical, it was emotional, even humiliating. For a devout Jew like Simon, touching an instrument of death could have felt defiling, a stark contrast to the sacred journey he intended to undertake. Yet, in this moment of compulsion, Simon's story becomes a reflection of something much deeper. It ties into the very essence of Jesus' teachings about discipleship. In Luke 9:23, Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me." Simon lived this out, quite literally, before he likely understood the spiritual magnitude of his actions. The physical act of carrying the cross was a foreshadowing of what it means to follow Christ, to step into suffering, to embrace sacrifice, and to walk behind him, even when the path is difficult. Luke's account specifically mentions that Simon carried the cross behind Jesus, Luke 23:26. This small detail is significant. To walk behind someone is to follow them. At that moment, Simon wasn't just helping Jesus, he was walking in his footsteps, sharing in his burden, and unknowingly becoming a symbol of what it means to follow Christ. But what happened to Simon after that day? While the Gospels don't provide a direct answer, the mention of his sons, Alexander and Rufus, hints at a lasting impact. Scholars have long speculated that this encounter with Jesus may have transformed Simon's faith. The possibility that his family became prominent in the early Christian community suggests that his brief moment of carrying the cross sparked something far greater, a legacy of faith that would ripple through generations. Consider how often this happens in our own lives. We're thrust into situations we didn't choose, asked to bear burdens we feel unprepared for. In the moment, it may seem random or even unfair. But later, we often see how those experiences shaped us, strengthened us, and connected us to something bigger than ourselves. Simon's story is a reminder of the unexpected ways God calls us into his plan. It challenges us to trust that even the interruptions, the hardships, and the moments of confusion have a purpose. And just as Simon's act of carrying the cross became a pivotal moment in history, our own acts of obedience, no matter how small they seem, can have a profound impact on the world around us. Simon of Cyrene's encounter with Jesus wasn't just about a single moment, it was about transformation. Imagine the scene as Simon walked behind Jesus, the weight of the cross digging into his shoulders. Every step brought him closer to Golgotha, closer to the place of execution. Around him, the crowd jeered, the soldiers barked orders, and the air was thick with tension. But there was something about Jesus, his quiet strength, his unwavering resolve, that must have left an impression on Simon. This wasn't an ordinary criminal being led to his death. Jesus bore himself differently, with a dignity that transcended his suffering. Simon, a man who likely knew nothing of Jesus before this day, suddenly found himself at the center of the most important moment in human history. It's hard to imagine that such an encounter wouldn't change a person. The mention of Simon's sons, Alexander and Rufus, in Mark's Gospel suggests that his family became deeply connected to the early Christian community. If Simon shared his experience with them, and how could he not, it likely shaped their understanding of who Jesus was and what he had come to do. The ripple effects of Simon's moment with Jesus remind us that faith is rarely an individual journey. Our choices, our obedience, and even our struggles often influence the people around us in ways we can't immediately see. What started as an interruption in Simon's life became a defining moment, not just for him, but for his family, and perhaps for generations to come. Simon's story also invites us to think about the burdens we carry. Each of us has a cross in life, challenges, responsibilities, or hardships that feel heavy and unwelcome. It's tempting to resist these burdens, to view them as interruptions or obstacles, but Simon's experience shows us that those very crosses can become opportunities for transformation. When Jesus taught about taking up our cross, he wasn't asking for passive acceptance of suffering. He was calling us to a deeper trust in God's plan, to a willingness to follow him even when the path is hard. Simon didn't choose to carry the cross, but in doing so, he stepped into a role that would forever tie him to the mission of Christ. Imagine the conversations Simon might have had in the days and weeks that followed. Did he tell others what it was like to feel the weight of the cross, to walk behind Jesus? Did he realize even then the privilege of being part of that moment? These are questions we can only speculate about, but one thing is clear. Simon's brief encounter with Jesus carried a significance far greater than he could have understood at the time. Simon's story is about more than just one man's experience. It's about the universal call to discipleship. His act of carrying the cross symbolizes what it means to follow Christ, not just for him, but for all of us. Jesus' teaching in Luke 9:23, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me," comes to life in Simon's actions. Though compelled by Roman soldiers, Simon's role reflects the essence of what it means to walk with Jesus. At its core, carrying the cross is about surrender. It's about setting aside our plans, our comfort, and even our sense of control to trust in God's greater purpose. For Simon, that surrender began in the most unexpected way. He wasn't a disciple or a follower of Jesus when the day began. He was a bystander, caught up in the chaos of the moment. But by the end of that day, his life had intersected with the life of Christ in a way that would change everything. There's a powerful message in that. God often uses ordinary people in extraordinary ways. Throughout Scripture, we see this pattern again and again. David was a shepherd before he became a king. Peter was a fisherman before he became a leader of the early church. And Simon was just a man on his way to celebrate Passover when he was called into the most significant story in history. This truth challenges us to reflect on our own lives. How often do we feel like bystanders in the grand narrative of God's plan? Like Simon, we might not see ourselves as central to the story, but in God's eyes, every person is chosen, valued, and uniquely equipped for a purpose. The question is, are we willing to step into that purpose, even when it comes unexpectedly? Simon's role also highlights the inclusivity of the gospel. As a man from Cyrene, a city in North Africa, Simon's presence in this story reminds us that God's kingdom is for everyone. The gospel is not limited by geography, ethnicity, or status. It's a message of hope and salvation for all people, from every nation and background. Revelation 7:9 paints a beautiful picture of this. A great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. Simon's story is a foreshadowing of that vision. His act of carrying the cross, though small in the grand scheme of things, symbolizes the global reach of God's mission. It's a reminder that no matter where we come from or what our circumstances are, we all have a place in God's plan. Simon of Cyrene's story challenges us to rethink how we view the burdens in our lives. Often the crosses we carry feel like interruptions, unwelcome, heavy, and inconvenient. But Simon's experience shows us that what seems like a burden can actually be a divine appointment. It's in those moments when we're called to step into the unexpected that God often does his greatest work. Think about how Simon must have felt as he walked behind Jesus. The weight of the cross wasn't just a physical strain, it was a public display of shame. People in the crowd likely mocked him, assuming he was complicit in Jesus' crime. Yet, what appeared to be a moment of humiliation became an act of profound significance. Simon's willingness to carry the cross placed him at the heart of the gospel narrative, forever tying his story to Jesus' mission. This truth speaks directly to us. How many times have we faced situations that felt overwhelming or unfair, only to look back later and see God's hand in them? The burdens we bear, the challenges we face in relationships, careers, or personal struggles, can be opportunities for growth, for deeper faith, and for impacting others in ways we may never fully understand. Simon's legacy also reminds us of the ripple effect of faith. His brief encounter with Jesus didn't just transform his own life, it likely influenced his family and their place in the early church. The mention of his sons Alexander and Rufus in Mark's Gospel suggests that Simon's faith journey didn't end on that day in Jerusalem. It continued, shaping his household and leaving a mark on the early Christian community. This ripple effect is something we all have the power to create. Our choices, how we respond to life's challenges, how we live out our faith, don't just affect us. They influence the people around us, often in ways we don't realize. Whether it's our children, our friends, or even strangers who observe our actions, our faith can inspire and encourage others to draw closer to God. Finally, Simon's story reminds us of the beauty of God's inclusivity. Here was a man from Africa, far from his homeland, chosen to play a role in the greatest story ever told. His presence in the gospel narrative is a testament to the fact that God's kingdom is for everyone. It's a kingdom that celebrates diversity, that invites people from all walks of life to take part in his mission. Simon's journey shows us that no one is too far, too different, or too insignificant to be used by God. As we reflect on Simon's story, let's ask ourselves, what crosses are we being asked to carry? And how might God be using those crosses to shape our faith, influence others, and draw us closer to him? As we continue reflecting on Simon of Cyrene's story, it's impossible to ignore the profound symbolism of his act. Carrying the cross wasn't just a random moment. It was a foreshadowing of what Jesus calls all of us to do as his followers. When Simon bent down to take the weight of the cross, he stepped into a role that embodies the essence of discipleship. Jesus' words in Luke 9:23, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me." Find a living example in Simon. Though he likely didn't understand the full significance of what was happening at the time, Simon's act of carrying the cross became a tangible representation of what it means to walk with Christ. It's a journey of surrender, sacrifice, and trust, even when the path ahead is uncertain. Simon didn't choose to carry the cross. He was forced into it by the Roman soldiers. Yet this moment of compulsion became an opportunity for transformation. It's a reminder that discipleship often begins in unexpected ways. Sometimes, we're drawn closer to God, not through our own plans, but through interruptions, moments that feel inconvenient or even painful, but ultimately lead us into a deeper relationship with him. Consider how this plays out in our own lives. Each of us has moments where we feel the weight of a burden we didn't ask for. It could be a difficult season in life, a challenging relationship, or a responsibility that feels overwhelming. These moments test our faith and stretch our patience. But Simon's story encourages us to see those burdens through a different lens. What if the very thing we're resisting is the thing God is using to shape us, to refine our character, and to draw us closer to him? Simon's act of carrying the cross also points to the ripple effect of obedience. His brief encounter with Jesus had a lasting impact, not just on his own life, but on his family and the early Christian community. The mention of his sons, Alexander and Rufus, in Mark's Gospel suggests that Simon's faith journey didn't end with that moment on the road to Golgotha. It continued, influencing his household and leaving a legacy that carried forward into the early church. This ripple effect is something we can all create in our own lives. When we respond to God's call with faith and obedience, even in the face of difficulty, we set an example for those around us. Our actions, our perseverance, and our trust in God can inspire others to seek him, to find hope in their own struggles, and to carry their own crosses with faith. Simon's story reminds us that the cross is not just a symbol of suffering, it's a symbol of transformation. When we take up our cross and follow Jesus, we step into a journey that leads to purpose, growth, and a deeper connection with God. Simon of Cyrene's story invites us to consider the unexpected ways God calls us into his purpose. When Simon began his day, he had no idea that he would cross paths with Jesus. He didn't plan to carry a cross or become part of an event that would change the course of history. Yet in that unplanned moment, Simon stepped into a role that forever linked him to the story of redemption. How often do we experience moments like this in our own lives? We make plans, set goals, and map out our days, only to have those plans disrupted. Sometimes these disruptions feel frustrating or unfair, but Simon's story challenges us to view life's interruptions as opportunities. What if the detour you didn't want is actually the path God has prepared for you? What if the burden you're carrying is the key to discovering your purpose? For Simon, what began as a forced act of service became a defining moment of discipleship. Though he was compelled by Roman soldiers to carry the cross, his actions reflect the heart of what it means to follow Christ. He didn't just carry a piece of wood, he shared in Jesus' suffering, walking behind him on the road to Golgotha. That image, Simon walking behind Jesus, is profoundly symbolic. It reminds us that following Christ often means stepping into hard places, carrying heavy burdens, and trusting that God's plan is greater than we can see. It's not always easy, but it's always meaningful. Simon's story also speaks to the inclusivity of the gospel. Here was a man from Cyrene, a city in North Africa, who found himself at the center of the most important event in human history. His presence in the gospel narrative is a powerful reminder that God's kingdom is for everyone, regardless of background, nationality, or status. The kingdom that invites all people to take part in his mission, to carry their crosses, and to follow Jesus. This inclusivity is a theme woven throughout Scripture. From the promise to Abraham that all nations would be blessed through his descendants, Genesis 12 verse 3, to the vision of a multitude from every tribe, and tongue worshiping God in Revelation 7 verse 9, the message is clear. The gospel is for everyone. Simon's role in the story of Jesus foreshadows this truth, reminding us that God's love knows no boundaries. Simon's act of carrying the cross wasn't just an act of physical strength. It was an act of spiritual significance. It showed the world that discipleship isn't reserved for the powerful or the elite. It's for ordinary people, people like Simon, people like us. As we reflect on Simon's journey, let's ask ourselves, how is God calling us to carry the cross in our own lives? What burdens has He placed in our path, and how might those burdens be shaping us into the people He's calling us to be? Simon of Cyrene's story is a testament to the truth that God often works through the unexpected. His brief but profound encounter with Jesus challenges us to see the interruptions and burdens of life not as setbacks, but as opportunities for growth, transformation, and purpose. When Simon was forced to carry the cross, he likely felt confused, frustrated, and maybe even angry. He had his own plans, his own reasons for being in Jerusalem, and yet his day was turned upside down by a demand he couldn't refuse. But in hindsight, that moment became the defining event of his life. It connected him to Jesus in a way few others experienced and left a legacy that resonated through generations. This is the beauty of God's plan. It often unfolds in ways we don't expect. The crosses we carry may feel heavy, but they are never without purpose. They teach us humility, strengthen our faith, and draw us closer to God. They also give us the chance to impact others, just as Simon's act of carrying the cross influenced his family and the early Christian community. Simon's story also reminds us of the importance of obedience. Even though he was compelled by Roman soldiers, his actions reflect the essence of discipleship, stepping into a role we may not have chosen, trusting that God is working through it, and following Christ, even when the road is hard. As we carry our own crosses, we're invited to follow Simon's example, to see interruptions as divine appointments, to embrace burdens as opportunities for transformation, and to trust that God is using every moment, every step, every struggle to weave our lives into His greater story. Before we conclude, let's pause and reflect. What cross are you carrying today? How might God be using it to shape your journey, to teach you something new, or to bless others? Simon's story reminds us that even the most unplanned and uncomfortable moments can be part of God's extraordinary plan. If this story resonates with you, take a moment to reflect on your own life. Share your thoughts, your struggles, or your experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear how God is working in your life. And if this message has encouraged you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of faith, inspiration, and hope. Thank you for joining us on this journey. As you go about your day, remember Simon's story. Whatever cross you carry, know that it's not the end of your journey. It's part of a greater purpose, a story that God is writing in and through you.